You're watching The Conservative Talks, brought to you by the ECR Party, your weekly Q&A show on the deeper themes driving the European news cycle. I'm your host, Jorge González-Gallarza. Every week, an expert roster of authors, lawmakers, and newsmakers will join me to unpack the events rocking the European Union's foundations in a short, digestible format from a conservative and Euro-realist angle. Welcome to another episode in our series, and today we are so delighted to be discussing with David Engels, who's a dear friend of Euro-realists across the continent and conservatives at large. David is a historian by training. He's a scholar of ancient history. He published widely whilst in his native Belgium, worked as a scholar and as a professor at several institutions in Belgium before finding an exile of sorts in Poland, where he's currently tuning in from. But he's got really a very interesting scholarly career across academe in different parts of Europe. He's now a scholar affiliated with the Zachodni Institute in Poznán in Poland, and perhaps most interestingly for our purposes today, David has spent really a considerable amount of time over the past, let's say, 5 to 10 years, reflecting and really analyzing and looking at the juncture in this thing that we call Europe. Historically, the place we're at in this process of bringing European nations together on a common set of institutions and values. And David's last project, his last kind of large book, is really a fascinating book. We'll provide the links. It is called Renovatio Europae, and I really want to get into David into just the richness and the wealth of intellectual content that is in the book. It's structured as a series of chapters, some of which were written by yourself, David. Others you've kind of brought a number of intellectuals that also want to discuss. And let's get right into the heart of it, perhaps by asking you what was the dynamic leading up to the publication of Renovatio Europae. What was sort of the driving purpose? What were these working groups that you convened in Poland like? What was the driving kind of theme that you were looking to analyze with all the people that you brought together and kind of the process leading up to the publication of the book?
Yeah, hi Jorge first, and thank you very much for the kind invitation. I'm really happy to have this chat with you. Thank you for your interest also in our book Renovatio Europae, which was one of my first projects at the Instytut Zachodni when I moved to Poland in 2018. And there are several origins of that book. On the one hand, there is, of course, my own personal commitment to the question of what I would call European patriotism. I feel deeply convicted about my identity, not just as a Belgian or as a bilingual French-German speaker, but also about being a European, being a Westerner. That is for me my true nation, you could say, but a nation which I don't see in an EU fashion as European being identical with universalist, cosmopolitan, multicultural, politically correct values and so on, but rather an identity that is deeply rooted in our history, in our tradition, that makes us unique, that makes us very different, not better or worse, but very different from the Chinese, the Indians, the Muslims, etc. And so the wish to somehow contribute to reconstructing some form of cultural patriotism was always very important for me. Then when I came to Poland, to the Instytut Zachodni, we very quickly agreed also with the director of the institute that it would really be an important sign, precisely because it would be coming from Poland, to show that the conservative institutions, conservative countries, such as most of the Visegrad countries, do not want to be presented as standing for chauvinism, nationalism, just thinking about their own interest, thinking better than others, but rather to show that their approach to conservatism is also a deeply European and Western approach. And so we had this idea of trying to switch from the usual criticism of everything that goes wrong with the European Union, rather to a constructive idea: how could we do something better? What could be a constructive idea of renovating the European Union and with it Europe, which is why we called our book also Renovatio Europae, a little bit like in allusion to the famous Renovatio Imperii of the early medieval rulers, who also tried to renovate, to reinstall the long lost old Roman Empire. That is why I then quickly managed to find a series of quite well-known European scholars coming from many European nations, and agreeing to deal with different aspects of this identity crisis of Europe, but also on some very concrete proposals how we could overcome these crises and go towards real Renovatio Europae.
This is tremendously useful, and I think it's so important to kind of set really the meat of your book and the intellectual meat that you develop in these chapters in the wider context of the juncture that we're in, and kind of what was happening around us in Europe as you work to bring people together at your institute and have them reflect on just all of the moving parts and all of the different pieces of the puzzle that we're faced with. And I think it is so important. I do want to remind our audience that you are a cultural historian, that you were a scholar of ancient history in Europe at large, looking at sort of the long-term trends that have made who we are. And I think that really kind of reverberates across your book. And perhaps something that I found really interesting that I'd love to delve into right away is this idea of wanting to focus on what you call identity and values as opposed to institutions and economics. And the latter two, as you explain in the book, have been really the overweening concern of the elites that have tried to sort of integrate Europe, which isn't a concern per se, but they've gone about it in a way that really has disregarded some of the things in your book and the idea of a European culture that should be put forth, that should be valued. And what I found most interesting was that your own chapters quote some of the founding fathers of the current supranational idea of Europe as having forewarned that Europe had to focus on institutions and values and my apologies, Europe had to focus on identity and values if the institutions and the economics were to succeed. Can you perhaps delve into a little bit deeper into where you see this conflict arising in Europe today, and why it is so important that we shift the focus back towards the underpinning thicket of values and identity that underpins this whole thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with pleasure. Well, I mean, with every society, every state, they can only function if they are based on a citizenry that feels some form of solidarity between themselves. A state can only function if the inhabitants of the richer regions of the state agree somehow to feel solidarity with those of the poorer parts of this country, and to all pay their taxes in order to assure some form of equality. So just when people feel a common identity, or people need a feeling of solidarity in order for states or societies to work, but you can only feel this form of solidarity if you share also a common identity. You have to realize that you have something in common with someone else in order to be solidary with him. From the moment onward you think, well, I have nothing to do with that guy, then it is very difficult to somehow convince him to give parts of his labor, interest, his money, or what else to a common goal. And the problem now is that while we still feel somehow this solidarity on a national basis, the European Union has unfortunately not managed to create, or rather to underline, this form of common European identity. They have only settled on the issue of human rights, of a universalist identity. They have and have lost the occasion to underline what makes Europe very, very special, and why, for example, in a situation of economic crisis, a German should agree to give some of his tax money to someone from Spain or from Greece when he is in crisis, and why he should rather part with his money from someone from poor European countries than with people in Pakistan or in Indonesia when they have a similar economic problem. And that is one of the issues that needs to be somehow explained, and somehow this identity needs to be underlined. Now, it is often said that this identity needs to be constructed, that the European Union should make efforts in constructing a common European identity. That is absolutely false from my point of view, because this European identity exists. It is there. It is our common shared history, and it is obvious for everyone who goes into a museum in Lisbon or in Berlin or in Rome. He immediately sees that we all share for centuries, if not millennia, a very similar history. We are all based on the Judeo-Christian religion. We are all based on Greco-Roman traditions. We have all gone through very similar states of our historical, institutional evolution, and so forth and so forth. We share so many things within Europe which we do not share with people from China or India, who have had a very different civilizational evolution. And so the European Union would have needed to insist on these common features, but it hasn't. And now there is, of course, the question why. And often, already at the beginning of the European communities, people like Robert Schuman, for example, have insisted on the fact that Europe needs to identify itself with its history, with its Christian tradition, not through re-Christianization, but simply through a positive attitude to this heritage and to this tradition, and that should Europe only focus on economics, institutions, Europe would lose her identity. But I think the things are not that easy, because many of these people who say, well, identity causes only trouble, let's just keep focused on purely material, allegedly objective issues such as rules, norms, institutions, and so on, they somehow are not aware of the fact that even below below this quest for just looking for norms, institutions, economic issues, there's also a form of ideology, which is, of course, the liberal ideology, which is not necessarily based on just a disinterest in identity question, but which is some form of identity itself, because it says, well, all that doesn't play any role. Christian identity, Greek tradition, even Muslim identity, all that is just some form of superstructure, but the real important things are the material interest of the single individual. And that is not an absence of ideology, but it is an ideology in itself, because it is based on extreme individualism, materialism, and so forth, and leads ultimately to atheism, to hedonism, to collectivism, and to exactly what we are living now. That is the transformation of an ultra-liberal system into, very strangely, a collectivist society. That is what we see by now, and that shows us, of course, what big an error it was at the beginning, that those people who still felt strongly about their European identity somehow agreed in leaving this identity out of the construction process, and leaving the field or the battlefield to people claiming they were just interested in objective realities, but who precisely defended a very specific approach to identity questions. And that is how conservatives somehow lost the battle. They lost it mentally and ideologically. And now we are seeing every day how they also lost it in a very concrete political fashion. And they are not even aware of it very often.
This is really interesting. And I think even though your book came out some time before this whole idea of like a conference on the future of Europe started giving concrete results, and we're speaking on the heels of, I believe, earlier this week, the first official statement of the leaders that had been convened as part of this conference on the future of Europe, that the first joint statement got signed this week, I believe, which I think is really a good, an interesting news cycle for us to hew to. And your book somewhat does that. But I think it is so interesting, David, because I do think that the elite consensus has already realized a lot of the things that are in your book, and we saw that. I mean, some of the questions that you've just outlined in terms of the sort of the tax protest sentiment that aroused around the Eurozone crisis, where a lot of people across the Eurozone started really questioning the values foundation of the idea of having financial transfers across the Eurozone. They didn't really, whether it was the German pensioner class or the young Greek, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese unemployed, the underlying social compact that kind of from which this idea of financial transfer springs had just been blurted out from the minds of all of these different people. And I think the system at that specific point was already hitting its face against a wall that you outline in your book. Something else that I find incredibly important in your book is that there is a larger Western backstory to this, and kind of the liberalist hubris of the 1990s, in which the European Union played a massive role, not just in spurring it worldwide, but also in embracing all of its premises in terms of believing really and embracing this idea that you didn't have to focus on the underlying sense of belonging that binds human beings together. And as long as you just took care of the material well-being and the symbolic well-being in terms of people finding emancipation and liberal license and the ability of being able to do whatever they want with their lives, the liberalist hubris of those decades, and I think we're seeing it crumble worldwide right now. But that was a moment in time when we totally disregarded all of the important building blocks that are in your book. So I want to maybe kind of turn towards more of a foresight problem that is really in your book as well. Towards the end, is you're a pessimistic guy, as are conservatives at large. But where are you least pessimistic? Where are you most hopeful that change is going to come from? One of the building blocks in your book is really awakening Europeans to the I don't want to call it clash of civilizations. I would just merely call it the idea of Europe being just a place of its own in a world riven by conflict and riven by different geostrategic and even cultural outlooks. So what are you most hopeful that the change that you advocate is going to come from? Is it going to come from geopolitics and the idea that we're now seeing being floated around in Brussels and some of the high places in Europe in terms of strategic autonomy and the idea of Europe being able to chart its own course in the League of Nations? Are you most hopeful about quite simply kind of the penetration of different cultural outlooks into our own urban like cities and European capitals? Where do you think that the change towards a self-confident European culture is the basis for the European project, however you define that? Where are you most hopeful that that's going to eventually come from?
Yeah, that's of course a very hypothetical question, so it's difficult to respond to that. You're absolutely true. Of course, I'm a pessimist somehow, even more so as I'm very strongly interested in morphological structures in the philosophy of history, especially, of course, Oswald Spengler, who is one of the thinkers which has really deeply influenced me because of his basic idea that civilizations, exactly like all social entities, entities and like physical beings have somehow a certain mortality. That is, they evolve, they grow, then they decline, and then they die. So civilizations are not immortal, and history is not teleological or linear, but it happens rather in cultural cycles. And it seems to me, at least, obvious, and to many other people too, that the Western civilization cycle is approaching its end. It's not yet absolutely there, and this end doesn't mean a cataclysm where everything breaks down, but at least a phase when people stop to be interested in their own history, when they prefer to enter in some form of post-historical feeling, some form of disconnection with their own tradition, when their cultural creativity is waning, and when they simply just limit themselves to their interest for their own small personal well-being and not necessarily fight for their family, for their religion, for their state, for their culture, for their belief, for their creed, or whatever, just interested in themselves. And so that makes them, of course, prey to all other influences, be it from a small elite from the within who can take the power without having too much to fear as resistance, or be it from barbarian forces or from enemies from the without. And I think we are slowly starting to really approach that post-historical phase in the West. So that is why I'm quite pessimist. But still, when it comes to somehow imposing at least some final political unity to the European world, a bit in analogy to the transformation of the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, which is a bit my specialty when it comes to ancient history. I think that something like that may still be possible as we are entering now, I think, a phase of strong social and political unrest that is already extremely obvious in some countries, such as France, for example, which is really at the brink of some form of latent civil war, and something else is similar is happening also in many towns, I think, in Belgium and even in the UK. And this transformation phase is, on the one hand, something that I personally would have liked to avoid, because it will bring with us extreme hardship, and the coronavirus lockdown measures are, of course, accelerating this process of dismantling of the west of Europe. But on the other hand, this could also be a chance. It could be the opportunity of seeing a reform program implemented, at least at the end of this transformation phase. And I think that is more important than ever for conservatives all over Europe, and especially in Western Europe, to become proud again about their cultural values, to somehow try to defend their identity in this cultural war that is approaching. You could say indeed that I'm pessimist when it comes to the general outlook on the future of Western civilization. But on the other hand, I guess that this phase of civil unrest, of disorder, might also be a chance of seeing European conservatives implement their own agenda. And I think it is really important that we manage through that difficult period that is to come, to somehow assert our own worldview, to conserve also our tradition, to be an example, not just in a political way, but also to being a credible example as a society of human beings, showing that through a certain cultural patriotism, to certain loyalty to our values, such as traditions, such as life, such as our Greco-Roman traditions, such as also Judeo-Christian beliefs, it will be possible to maintain our course, to guarantee some form also of social justice, at least for the people also belonging to our zone of influence throughout these years, and then sooner or later again develop some form also of political credibility that could help in somehow reforming what then will remain of Western Europe, because it is obvious that the coronavirus crisis and all these different social elements of crisis will become more and more obvious during these next years, and see a fundamental questioning of the ancient, power structures as they have evolved since the 1950s, since the 1960s. I think that many Western European countries are already now at the brink of realizing that our traditional liberal democratic parliamentary state system is somehow not adapted anymore to the different crises of the modern world, which we also sometimes have produced ourselves, but still this is an issue that in France, for example, is very well known, where many people already are saying now, well, what we would need most is some form of more or less even authoritarian reform in order to bring the state again on some path towards a brighter future. And that atmosphere is growing stronger and stronger. And in order to avoid now the West collapsing really into authoritarianism, into social unrest and so on, it is needed by conservatives to be aware of all that fact and to implement this, when the time is ripe, this agenda of what I called Hesperialism. That is the situation for the West. Of course, the east of Europe is in a somewhat different situation, as at least for the moment. I don't see in countries such as Poland or Hungary, the Visegrad countries, even the southeastern Europe, I don't see a similar potential of implosion. I think these countries are much more stable. They are characterized by a much greater cultural, but also social and ethnical homogeneity that could form some element that may protect them. Already now we see that in the Corona crisis, they managed to somehow assure much better economic growth. They're much more stable. And so I simply can't see scenes of riots, of violence, of civic disobedience and disorder in Warsaw, as you can see them now in Paris or even some days ago in Lyon. I think the East may be much more stable than the West, and perhaps growingly also be a model for a new construction or reconstruction of an alternative form of European unification once the current cultural mainstream has led itself to some form of absurdity and will lose credibility with the large masses of electors and voters who will simply realize that this isn't the path we can go along without losing everything that characterizes us as a civilization.
This is wonderful to be able to end on this note, because it is a sort of a West European cultural roadmap that you outline in your book. It will find, I think, hopefully an attentive, if not an optimistic or an enthusiastic audience in Western Europe, primarily, where you're trying to drum up sort of a sense of, cultural awakening at a time of crisis. But I do like that we're ending on a note of just even kind of within the cultural space that we're trying to revive, spotlighting some of the obvious differences. And you still kind of bring together in this project a number of intellectuals from different corners of the old world, and it is a task that has to be taken up by folks from across the spectrum of space, right? And I'm so glad we're ending on this note, and I would really encourage everyone watching this stream to get a copy of Renovatio Europae. It is a delightful set of essays touching on different aspects of David's thought as it has matured over the years regarding the questions of European renewal. And really, David, thank you so much for availing yourself, and hopefully we'll be able to speak to you on another occasion as the news cycle doesn't cease to kind of provide the opportunities for these kinds of conversations. So thank you so much for availing.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for our discussion. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That is all the time we have for this episode. If you like what you've watched, stay tuned for future episodes on YouTube and across the ECR Party's social media presence. Thank you.